How to sew the Sew Medallion Quilt with Amber Makes. Learn a variety of blocks to make this beautiful medallion quilt. Follow me and I'll show you how. Cutting out. Start off by choosing a panel or a quilt block for the centre of your quilt. The measurements for this are listed in the instructions. You now need to choose 5 fat eighths in colours or prints which complement the centre block. So it picks up some of the colours or the prints or colours that you think will frame it nicely. Next, you need to choose some plain fabrics for the borders and the binding that complement it. And then finally, choose a background fabric which is light or dark enough for the other fabrics to stand out from. We chose white for our quilt, but all the information for this is in the instructions. Next, cut out all of the pieces. The instructions list what size they need to be and which fabrics you need to cut them from. Do label each one as I've done here. You can just do handwritten labels and pin them on. It's much easier if you cut everything in advance and it's all labelled. Once you've cut all the fat eighths, you can then cut your plain fabrics that you're going to use for the borders and the binding. And again, I've labelled all of those so I know which is which. And then cut the background fabric. Again, label everything. Take your time to do this following the instructions for all the measurements. Attaching strip border 1. Take the centre panel and all the border 1 top, bottom and side strips. Place the border 1 top strip on the top and the border 1 bottom strip below the centre panel. And then sew them together right sides facing. Then when you've done that, you can sew one border side strip to the right of the centre panel and one to the left. I'm just laying them out here so you can see what it looks like in advance, but sew the top and bottom in place, and then when you've done that, sew the side in place, always sewing them right sides facing. Once it's sewn together, it will look like this, and you can see that I've pressed the seams towards the borders just to keep everything flat and away from that centre panel. Making Flying Geese border 2. We're going to start by making the Flying Geese, which is a great method for making flying geese in one go. Take 4 border 2 Flying Geese wing squares, put the others to one side for a moment, and draw a diagonal line from one corner to the other on the wrong side of each of them. With a plain fabric like this, obviously it's impossible to tell the difference between the right side and the wrong side, but if you're using a fabric which you can tell, this diagonal line must be drawn on the wrong side. So just draw it. I'm using a heat erasable pen here, but you could just draw it lightly in pencil because you will be cutting along this line later. Now once you've drawn those lines, take one of the Flying Geese body A squares and put the others to one side. Just clip it back into place. Now take one of the wings and place it in the top left-hand corner, so the diagonal line runs like this, and place the other in the bottom right-hand corner, so the diagonal line runs like this, and you will see the squares overlap slightly in the centre. Now pin either side of this line. We're going to be sewing 1/4 inch outside of this line. So if you place your pins at least 1/2 inch away from the line, then you'll be able to keep the pins in place while you're sewing. I also like to put one pin just across the centre, and that holds those little corners in place. You'll have to take that out later. Now stitch a scant 1/4 inch seam either side of that line. A scant seam means that it is just a little less than 1/4 inch. And then cut along the drawn line. So just like 1 or 2 fabric threads less than 1/4 inch. It just helps with accuracy. Cut along the line. Now you've made 2 big triangles. Place them on your pressing mat and fold the smaller wings triangles over so that the seam allowance is facing towards them. So press them over so they're nice and flat, and then repeat that with the other one. Fold the wings triangles over so that the seam allowance is facing towards them, and press it nice and flat. Now take another of the wings triangles and place it on the bottom corner, so you'll find that the point, that line runs between the triangles sewn on, and then you make sure that the raw edges and the bottom corner of this wings square is matching. And you can see that the point just extends a little bit beyond. And then take the other piece that you've made and place the other wings triangle in exactly the same place. And pin either side of it, because we're going to be sewing 1/4 inch either side of that line, so it just helps to keep it in place. Now sew 1/4 inch, scant 1/4 inch either side of that drawn line. And then they will look like this. So you can see that the seam extends beyond the seams where the first triangles were sewn on. Again, cut along the drawn line. That will separate that into 2 pieces, and cut along the other drawn line, and that will separate that into 2 pieces. So again, place them on your pressing mat and press the seams over to one side towards the wings, and that is 1 flying geese. And repeat that with all of them so that you press the fabric over to one side towards the wings. So you've now made 4 flying geese from those squares. All you need to do now is trim them to size, because they're a little bit bigger than is needed. You trim them to size to make them accurate. They need to measure 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. So the best way to do this is place your ruler on top of it. Now what I like to do is place the diagonal line, the 45-degree line, on my ruler on the sewn line, and then make sure that it's 2.25 inch markers in the centre. Then if you line up the 4.5 inch mark and trim the other side, then you know that it's exactly 4.5 inches long and it's placed centrally. Trim off the top now. So if you place the 1/4 inch mark at the top of that point where the body joins the wings, just trim the top of that off. And then you know you've got your 1/4 inch seam allowance there, and then turn it around and place it so it's 2.5 inch mark on there. And then trim the other end. Now repeat that to trim all of those flying geese in the same way. Now you have 4 beautifully trimmed and accurate flying geese. So you now need to repeat this process with the remaining 2 border 2 flying geese body A squares and the wings, and also the flying geese body B squares. Making the diamond squares. Take 1 border 2 diamond square and 4 border 2 diamond corner squares. Put the remainder to one side for now, because we're going to work on 1 diamond square at a time. On the wrong side of the 4 corner squares, draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner. You can use an erasable pen or a pencil for this, but just make sure it's not too dark. Once you've done that, take the border 2 diamond square, take just one of them, place the others to one side for now, and place it right sides up. Now take one of those corner squares and put one in the top left-hand corner so that the diagonal line runs like this from bottom left to top right, and pin it into place. If you pin away from the line, you're going to be sewing exactly on that drawn line, so pin away from it, you can keep the pins into place. Put another corner square in the bottom right-hand corner of the diamond square so that the diagonal line runs from bottom left to top right, just like this. Now sew along the drawn lines on both squares, and it will look like this. Fold over the corner of that corner square so it meets the corner of the diamond, so the diamond square. So fold it over so it meets the corner. You may need to pull this slightly depending on if you've stitched absolutely accurately, but by folding it over first before you trimming it, you'll get a more accurate finish, and then trim that corner off 1/4 inch outside of the drawn line, 1/4 inch towards the corner. But by folding it over and then trimming, you'll get a more accurate finish. And then obviously because you've trimmed it, it's pushed the corners in slightly, so just press them back again. But by doing it this way, you've got nice, neat square corners. Now take the other two diamond corner squares that you've drawn lines on and place one in the top left-hand corner. So the diagonal line runs like this from bottom left to top right. Again, pin it into place at the top and the bottom. And then take the other diamond corner square, place that in the bottom right-hand corner. So the diagonal line runs from bottom left to top right. So basically what you're doing is turning the print square into a diamond by cutting off the corners with the background squares. Sew along these drawn lines exactly the same way as before. Press the corner square over so it meets the corner first before you do any trimming, and do the other one as well. Make sure that the corner of that square meets the corner of the main square. And then trim it off. And then trim off the other corner. I'm using a rotary cutter and ruler, but for these little corners you can just use a pair of scissors. Just make sure you trim it about 1/4 of an inch outside, and make sure you're only cutting through those two fabric layers. So that's one diamond in a corner square. Repeat this to make 4 diamond corner squares in total. Attaching Flying Geese border 2. Take the Flying Geese you've just made and sew together for the top border them together in the following order. So just lay them out to start off with A, B, A, B, A. Remember, all of this information is in the instructions, so you don't need to remember, it's all written down. A, B, A, B, A. And then sew them together in a row by sewing them right sides together, and then they'll look like this. I've pressed all of the seam allowance over to one side. Repeat this to make the bottom border in exactly the same way, A, B, A, B, A. To make the side borders, they need to be sewn in the opposite order, so they have to be sewn B, A, B, A, B. This is just so that they are alternating around this border, just for a more uniform finish. This is why I've done them in this order, so they alternate. So sew those all together to make one side border like this. And repeat that to make the other side border in the same order. You will have some Flying Geese left over, but you can just put these to one side and use them for your own projects, just because of the way that they're made. Now sew the top border to the top and the bottom border to the bottom edge. You're sewing to the edge of border 1 of the piece you've just made. So I've sewn one to the top, one to the bottom, and you can see I've pressed the seams towards border 1, but it's up to you which side you press them to. Now to make the side borders, you need to take a diamond square and sew one diamond square to each end of the side borders by sewing them right sides facing, because the diamond squares will be going in the corners. So there's one side border complete, and repeat that to make the other side border in exactly the same way. You can now sew the side borders to the right hand and the left hand side of the border 1 of the piece you've already made. Make sure you match up the seams as well at the corners where the top of those diamond squares are. Make sure they match up with the border 1, just for a neater finish. So you can see here border 2 is now sewn into place, all the seams match up, and I've pressed the seams open for these due to the extra bulk, just to make them lay flatter. So you're now ready to start on border 3. Attaching strip border 3. Take the border 3 top, bottom and side strips. Sew one border 3 top and bottom strip to the top and one border 3 top and bottom strip to the bottom. You're sewing obviously to the piece. A medallion quilt is always made by sewing one border round to the borders already assembled at a time. Once you've sewn the top and bottom strip on, you can then sew the side strips, one to the right hand side and one to the left hand side. Always sew them right sides facing and sew them with border 2 on top, so the one with the most seams, just so that you can make sure the seams stay pressed over to one side. Once you've sewn it, it will look like this. So border 3 is now in place. And you can see with this one, I've pressed the seams over towards border 3 just because there's less bulk there and it helps it to lay flatter. So you are now ready to start making and sewing on border 4. Making thread spool border 4. We're going to start by making the thread spools, and the first thing to do is make the spool ends. So take all the spool end corner squares and draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of each of them from one corner to the opposite corner. If you do all of these in advance, it's quicker later. Now take one of the spool ends in the print fabric. Take one spool end corner and place it in the corner. So we just place it in the bottom left corner of one spool end strip so it matches up. And then place the diagonal line like this so it runs from top left to bottom right, and place the other spool end corner on the other side so the diagonal line runs from bottom left to top right. So the diagonal lines are facing opposite directions and the raw edges of the spool end corners are matching up. Sew together along those lines and it will look like this. Fold the spool end corner over to the corner of the spool end so that the fabric raw edges match up exactly, and press into place, and repeat that with the other one. Fold the corner over and press it into place. This just helps you to get a neater finish because you know those corners are in the right place. Trim off the seam allowance so it's about 1/4 of an inch, making sure you only cut through the 2 fabric layers, not the top one. And then press it back into place because it will have folded over just as you were doing that trimming. And that is one top spool end. You need to repeat this exactly to make 12 top spool ends in total. Here they all are. Put them all into a pile so you know that these are your top spool ends. To make the bottom spool ends, take one of these spool ends and place a spool end corner on the left hand side and pin it so the diagonal line runs from bottom left to top right. Put another spool end corner on the right hand side matching up raw edges and pin it so that the diagonal line runs from top left to bottom right. Sew together along those drawn lines. In the same way as before, fold the corner over so that the point of the corner meets the point of the corner on the fabric beneath, and give it a press. Then trim the seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch as before, and trim the other seam allowance. Fold the corner back over and give it a press. This makes one bottom spool end, so repeat this to make 12 bottom spool ends in total. And put these to one side for the making the spool bodies next. Making the spool bodies. To make the spool body A, take one spool body A piece and 2 spool body side strips. Put the others to one side for now. So one spool body side strip to either side of the spool body A piece. Pin it in place right sides facing. You can also pin the other one in place. They'll overlap, but you won't sew through them. So make sure you sew them to the sides. Pin, then sew together. Once they're done, fold the seam allowance, the top fabric, so the sides fabric over, so that the seam allowances are folded to one side, and press. And then repeat this to make 6 spool body A's in total, in exactly the same way, making sure that you press each one as you go. To make the spool body B, it's exactly the same thing. Take one spool body B piece and 2 spool body side strips. Sew them either side of the spool body B, again making sure that the raw edges are matching up and that you pin them together. and then sew them together down each of the sides, and then open it out. Fold the spool body side strip over, so that means you're pressing the seam allowance over to one side. Give it a good press, and then repeat this to make 6 spool body Bs in total. So there's all your spool bodies now finished. Completing the thread spools. So we're now going to sew the ends to the bodies. So take one of the thread spool bodies A and put a top spool end at the top and a bottom spool end at the bottom, and then turn over so they're right sides facing and pin together. I try and make sure that I match the seams here, just because it will look a bit neater. So if you just put a pin vertically through the seam of the spool end and into the seam of the spool body like this, then they match up. I mean, it doesn't matter if they don't match perfectly on every single one, but I find if you take the time just to push this vertical placement pin through, then place a pin through the seam, you can remove the placement pin. I just find that you are more likely to be accurate. And then pin it together at either end, making sure those raw side and top edges are matching. And then in the same way, you can pin the bottom spool end into place, match the seams as before, and then sew together, and then it will look like this. And then fold the spool end over so that the seam allowance is facing towards the spool end. I just prefer them pressed to one side like this, but if you want to press them open, that's fine. I just like to do them like this. And then you need to repeat this so that you make 6 thread spool block A's with all their spool ends on place. To make the thread spool block B's, again take the spool bodies and the top spool end and the bottom spool end, sew them together right sides facing in exactly the same way as you constructed thread spool block A, making sure that you match the seams. Press the seams over to one side. You've got a lot of seams here, so you may find if you give it a quick spray with light spraying with water and then press, that you'll get them to lay flatter. And then you've got 6 thread spool block B's. Making the pinwheel blocks. The pinwheels are made from 4 HSTs, so to save time and fabric, I'm going to show you how to make 8 at a time. So start off by taking one of the Border 4 Pinwheel Fabrique background squares and draw a diagonal line on the wrong side from one corner to the opposite corner. Then turn it around and draw another diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner so that they cross in the middle. Now place this marked square right sides facing with the print square and pin them together. So pin together along all the sides. I just place a pin in the centre of the sides and then just place a pin into the centre to hold it all together. Now you need to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam either side of both drawn lines, so you are sewing 4 seams in total, and then it will look like this. Now you need to cut along the drawn line or from one corner to the other. I've pressed mine so my drawn line's disappeared, but don't move the fabric, just move the cutting mat. I'm using a rotating cutting mat. If you don't have one of these, then just move around your table or move the whole mat, but it's important not to move the fabric. So you've cut through the diagonal lines. Now before you move it, you need to cut vertically up the centre. So you cross where the centre of that and then turn it around and cut vertically up the centre again. So you're making 4 cuts, 2 diagonals and 2 straights. That now divides those 2 pieces of fabric into 8 half square triangles with no waste and much quicker way of doing it. Now to finish them off, you need to take each of the half square triangles, fold the seam, fold one triangle up so that the seam allowance is pressed to one side. I like to press it towards the darker fabric, and that creates the half square triangle, and then repeat that to fold and press all of them in the same way. So now you've got 8 of them. Now these are obviously made a little bit bigger than needed so that you can trim them to size, because it's much better to trim them to size. You'll get a more accurate finish. Make sure that the seam diagonal line goes through the centre by placing it on the 45-degree angle on your cutting, and then trim them so that they are all 2.5 inches square. So cutting along all the sides. It's worth taking the time to do this accurately because it's so much neater when you're joining them together later. So finish off all of those squares to make 8, and then repeat this with the other border 4 pinwheel fabric A square and the fabric B square to make 16 HSTs in total. Now we're going to make 1 pinwheel. You need 4 half square triangles for that. So take 4 of them and lay them out in this arrangement, which is the pinwheel arrangement. Place the 2 in the top row, right sides facing and sew together, and the 2 in the bottom row, right sides facing and sew together. So now you've sewn the top row, and I've pressed the seam over to one side and the seam over to one side in the bottom row, so they're facing in opposite directions. You can then nest the seams by placing one row on top of the other, pulling it along very gradually until the 2 shelved edges meet, and then pin together at that seam. And then pin together at the top and pin together on the other side, and then sew this together all the way along, making sure you sew through the centre of where that seam is. And when you open it up and press it, you've created 1 pinwheel. Repeat this with the remaining HSTs to make 4 pinwheel blocks in total. Attaching thread spool border 4. Take the border 4 sashing and the thread spool blocks that you've made earlier, and you need to, for the top border, place them in the following order: sashing, thread spool block A, sashing, thread spool block B, sashing, thread spool block A, sashing. So it's all in this order. So it goes A, B, A in the thread spools, and you've got sashing between and either side of them. Now sew all of these in a row, right sides facing, and then it will look like this. And I've pressed all the seams over to one side towards the sashing. Repeat this process and this order to make the bottom border in exactly the same way. To make the side borders, they're sewn in a different order so that there's sashing either side, but they're in the orders of B, A, B. But again, all of these details are in the instructions, so just follow the order in there so you can see what order to put everything in. Now take the top border and sew it to the top of border 3 that you've already sewn together. So place that right sides facing it and sew it in place. And then sew the bottom border to the bottom edge. Sew it together and then press the seam. Now to finish off making the side borders, take one of the assembled thread spool block borders you've already made and sew one of your pinwheel blocks to each end, because these were going to sit in the corners of border 4. So just pin them to the top of the sashing and sew it into place, and then pin another pinwheel block to the sashing and sew it into place. This completes one of your side borders, and repeat this to make the other side border in exactly the same way. And then sew the side borders to either side of your piece block, making sure that those side seams at the corners match up. It will just be a lot neater if they match up. So do pin those together first before you pin the rest of it, using those vertical placement pins that I've shown you earlier to just get those corners to match up. So once you've sewn it all together, there's border 4 in place now with your thread spools and your pinwheels to give it that little sewing nod. Border 4 is now complete. Attaching strip border 5. Take all the assembled borders so far and then take border 5 top and bottom strip. Take one of the top and bottom strips and sew it right sides facing along the top, and then take the other top bottom strip and sew it right sides facing along the bottom. Remember, after you've pinned it in place, to always sew with the piece with the most piecing, so that's border 4, on top. It just means that you can keep all of those seams that you've either pressed open or to one side in place. Once you've sewn the top and bottom into place, you can then sew the border 5 side strips down each side. So take one of the side strips and pin it right sides facing down the side and sew in place, but remember, sew with border 4 on top so that you can make sure that you keep all of those seams sewn to the right direction so that they don't get twisted. But you've got no seam matching to do here, so this is a really simple border to attach. Once that's done, you've now completed border 5. Give it all a really nice press to make sure all those seams are laying flat on the top. And you can see I've pressed them over towards border 5. So you're now ready to attach border 6. Attaching strip border 6. Take one border 6 strip and sew it to the top of border 5. You can see the border 6 is wider than border 5. It just gives it a balance to have a narrow border and then a wider border like this. Sometimes it's nice to change the width of borders just to give your quilt more balance and interest. Sew the other border 6 strip to the bottom of border 5. And then press the seams over to one side or open as you prefer, and then press it flat from the front as well to give it a neater finish. Now to create the side strips, these have got corners in them. So take one border 6 strip and one border 6 corner and place that and sew it to the top of that strip by placing them right sides facing and sewing to the top. Then take another border 6 corner and sew that to the bottom of the border 6 strip. That makes one side strip, and repeat this to sew a border 6 corner to the top and the bottom of another border 6 strip. Once that's done, your side strips will look like this. I've pressed the seams open on these and flat just because it makes it easier for sewing into place. So sew one side strip down the side, making sure you match up the seams, just because you'll get a neater finish, because you want those little print corner squares to sit right in the corner. So do match up the seams before you sew them into place. There are no other seams to match up, so it's worth doing that. And then pin and sew the other side strip to the other side, matching up the seams as like we did the last time. Sew that into place and then give it a good press from the outside, and now border 6 is now complete. So all that's left to do is finish your quilt, because the quilt top is now all complete with a variety of different blocks. Give it a good press before you move on to the next stage. Finishing the quilt. So now your quilt top is finished. The next thing you need to do is quilt it. Lay the backing fabric right sides down, the wadding on top, and then your patchworked pieced quilt on top, and then quilt it together in whichever pattern you prefer. I've quilted along the lines and some of the seam lines, but it's entirely up to you. Just quilt it using as much or as little quilting as you like. It depends on what finish you want. Once that's done, trim the edge of the wadding and the backing fabric so it's levelled with the quilt, level with the edge of the quilt top. I'd like to use a rotary cutter and ruler to do this as it keeps it nice and square. Once it's all trimmed, it will look like this, and all you've got left to do is bind it. Now I've used a double fold binding for this, and I've sewn it in place from the wrong side of the quilt so that I can top stitch it from the right side. For more detailed and in-depth instructions about binding a quilt, mitering corners and joining the pieces, you will find a video tutorial and a free set of PDF instructions called How to Bind a Quilt on the Amber Makes website. So if you haven't done binding before, I've gone into a lot of detail about how to do single fold and double fold, and all the details are on there for you to use so that you can bind your quilt. Then, once it's bound, I've top stitched it from the right side. My medallion quilt is now finished. It's got a variety of different blocks. We've used half square triangles, flying geese, thread spools, pinwheels, a centre panel, different binding. So it's a really good way of learning how to do lots of different blocks and making a beautiful medallion quilt at the same time. So all it's left to do now is hang it on the wall or put it on the sofa.